The views and opinions expressed by the following program are those of the host, guests, and callers and are not necessarily those of this station or Webster Rock Hill Ministries, its management, or other hosts or underwriting sponsors. Programs presented by KWRH-LP are for educational and entertainment purposes only.
In studio right now, Mac Williams from History to You. Mac, welcome to In Tune, man.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
He doesn't sound snotty. What's the deal here?
He hasn't been around all of our sickies here.
Oh, is that what it is? Well, trust me, by the time he leaves here, he's going to need that box of Kleenex that we have over there.
Hey, Mac is a gentleman that I met several weeks ago at a festival up on North 14th Street.
Yes.
And had an opportunity to talk to him and see some of the things that he does. And this is a great program, folks, so listen carefully to what you're going to get from Mac. Mac, tell us a little bit about you, and then we're going to talk about History to You.
Oh, absolutely. Well, actually, before I begin, I just want to send a shout out. I have family listening in, so I just want to say hey to my mother and my brothers and sisters that are listening in here, because History to You is actually a family affair. I started collecting artifacts that related to African American history roughly about 10 years ago. It was kind of interesting. I visited the Griot Museum on St. Louis Avenue at the time, and I was really intrigued by the displays and actually wanted to volunteer to see if I could contribute, whether it's as a curator or even building a website, however I could contribute. And unfortunately, I was rebuffed at the time, but I guess it was a blessing in disguise, because that rather than allow that to deter me, what I envisioned at that point was, hey, I love history. I've always had a passion for it. I was raised in a home in which our history was emphasized. And so my natural step for me was to begin collecting myself. And I started out, the very first item I purchased was the first edition Up From Slavery of Booker T. Washington. And once I got that bug, it really just snowballed from there. Now, having said that, I was collecting, but I didn't necessarily have the vision for History to You at the time. But over the course of a series of events, certainly the events in Ferguson impacted me traumatically. And I was out, on West Florissant. I was out on New Florissant demonstrating. And what I noticed was there was a disconnect between the older generation that saw themselves as the vanguard and a younger generation that wanted their voices to be heard, but they didn't have the megaphones. They weren't the first ones out in the front of the march. And so where you had individuals clamoring, to be the voice in the older generation, I in turn turned and began talking with everyone, just trying to understand what was missing. And when you look at the results, some of the things that have come out of Ferguson, one of the shortcomings, and I think one of the lessons that we had to learn from that experience, is knowing exactly what we want. As a result, what are we demonstrating for? If we're demonstrating for justice, that's one thing. But if we're wanting more than that, then we need to understand and define that.
Did you find that was not articulated very clearly?
Well, I think it took a while for that to be articulated, and I still think that some of those issues have yet to be addressed within the community. And the other point being that I think the individuals that are being asked aren't always reflective of the actual community. And I think that disconnect, we live in a day and age where everyone can be on YouTube, on Instagram, on Twitter. And so you have this proliferation of voices, but no one's being heard. Everyone's talking, but no one's being heard. And so I think because of that, you have so many voices, and not all of these voices are truly articulating our genuine needs and concerns. They're expressing opinions. They're promoting the ideas of others. And so all of that led me to search within myself to try to understand, okay, I have this passion for history. I have this understanding. I went to school, have my bachelor's in political science. I have an understanding of the social dynamic that's going on here. What can I do? I can try to elbow everyone out of the way to the front of the line to be heard. But what am I going to accomplish with that if I don't have mechanisms in place to actually act on what I'm asking and what I'm talking about? Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I tried to express to everyone, and I was calling in on radio stations trying to figure out, was let's establish a scholarship fund for Michael Brown in his honor, so that when one falls, we can send 10 off to college to finish the job that he was planning on starting. This is a young man that was intending on going to school to further himself and better himself. So when we lose someone like that in the community, why aren't we looking to set up mechanisms in place to make sure that not only do we send 10 more, but if we're doing that annually, this one man's death can lead to thousands of being educated and having better opportunities for their families.
So the kind of piggyback with this is that the mechanism of history to you is set up to fill in gaps that myself would have about the overall history, or to give history to people who don't know what the history is.
Yeah, it's a combination of both. When you look at the last statistics that I was studying were from 2015, 2016, the most recent records they had available on the State of Missouri website for the Department of Education. And you're looking at the different school districts, and we're ranging in terms of competency, 25, 30, 40% in history and social studies. And so what that's telling me is that our school system is not producing citizens, or I should say citizens, but educated citizens. In other words, when you're graduating from high school, you should have a basic understanding of what your rights are as a citizen, what your role is as a citizen, and what your potential is as a citizen, what your options are. And I think that's something that graduating from high school, students have a better understanding of math and science because we focus STEM. Everything is STEM. But it's one thing to have that understanding and to have a foundation in math and science. But if you don't know who you are, then you're setting yourself up for exploitation of those skills that you've acquired elsewhere.
Interesting perspective, because the identity of the individual in society stems from understanding history. I'm using STEM in a different
Absolutely.
way, from understanding history and why are we now and we've talked about this on the show, why are we in this situation we're in? Well, if you go back and look at history, you can understand that a little bit. I remember there was a commercial for a group that said an educated consumer is our best customer. An educated citizen is an involved citizen.
Absolutely. And I hearken back to my time as a student, and I'm always thinking about, okay, how did I become passionate about history? Well, part of it is I grew up with a father that talked about the importance of education all the time. Rather than, and oftentimes it was a form of punishment in the sense that when we would get in trouble as kids, we would be disciplined, but most of the discipline came in the form of lecturing us on the importance of education, why the mistake that we made was wrong, and what we should do different. So that type of parenting where and my father would literally spend hours. Now, my mother provided the order, and she provided the culture, in the sense that she made sure that we knew what Black art was, and that everything in our home reflected a sense of pride in who we were as a people. And so for me, I had no issues of self-doubt. I had no issues with feeling that there was anything that I could not do.
You had your identity.
And it was instilled early on and only enhanced. I went to Cardinal Ritter High School, and it's not a commercial for Cardinal Ritter, but it saved my life. Because I grew up, we grew up in that home and in that environment, and I grew up in the Normandy School District in that area. And you still had the pressure, the social pressures, the gang violence, the drug culture. Mm-hmm. And I grew up in the late 80s, early 90s. And so my adolescent years were really at the height of the drug and gang epidemic here in St. Louis. And so I was susceptible, just like any other kid, to wanting to be with that crowd. And some of the to be honest with you, in some cases, you didn't have a choice. If you're from one part of Normandy and you have issues with another part, we still have to go to school together. You still have to get on that bus. You still have to, get off the bus. And so you still have to deal with those things on a daily basis. And so when I went through the Normandy School District, I was actually kicked out my freshman year of high school. But again, I had a supportive family. And that helped me to understand that you can get knocked down, but you have to get back up. And that's the true reflection of who you are as an individual. And so I was blessed to be in a situation where my grandmother was able to, we weren't well off by any means. And so we had our own struggles, but fortunately, she had just won a settlement. She had an accident, won a settlement, and again, a family of sacrifice. She ensured, and my grandparents together ensured that I was able to go to Cardinal Ritter. It was because I was in a situation where I couldn't go back to Normandy. And I was actually on what they call an indefinite suspension. So I couldn't, anywhere I transferred, I was still under suspension. And so my choices at that point were Job Corps or private school. And Cardinal Ritter saved my life. It was an environment in which you could be smart. It was okay to be smart. It was actually encouraged to be smart. And that's a world of difference when you're going into a school where your first thought is self-preservation to your first thought is education. And where it was truly a family environment. And so all of those things have compelled me or put in me personally a sense of responsibility. I have an obligation to do whatever I can to help as many people as I can.
The investment your grandmother and grandfather made in you is now, the dividends are being paid out in history to you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, again, I've always just had the dream of giving someone else that feeling that I had. I used to, and it's funny to say this now, but I vividly remember my third grade, telling everyone I wanted to be everyone's talking about being a fireman or being a basketball player, football. I wanted to be president of the United States. And that's because I had a family that instilled that degree of confidence in what we could do. And this is 1980s. And I'll never forget telling my principal and her laughing. And as an 8-year-old child, it didn't necessarily register at that time, but it stuck with me. Mm-hmm. And so having that experience of being told what or not even being told, but being made to feel that, yes, I understand you have a dream, but that's not really realistic. I wanted to make sure that I do what I can to lift those barriers, to make sure that any child that don't feel inhibited. And I think that starts at home. And so what makes History to You different is the community outreach that we do are more geared towards the adults, because we recognize that as if you instill that degree of passion in the parent, it's going to be conveyed to the child. You mentioned earlier, you were talking about the literacy program. If we are focusing on it, we have the book club, what we call Back to the Classics book club.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that.
And so our point of emphasis is reaching to the parents, because if the parents are reading, then the child is either directly or indirectly going to pick that up. See, we focus on finances. We're always talking about providing. But what are we giving up in our family structure in exchange for that economic security.
You know, it's interesting you talk about that economics right now, because I read an article this morning in the Post-Dispatch, and it comes out of Baltimore, that there was a study that jobs do not, this was surprising, it surprised everybody, that jobs do not take people out of poverty. That these particular jobs that they're talking about, where people will then, when jobs are made available, other people will go to the jobs. But the jobs that happen within a community where they really need the jobs,
Right.
they don't go to those jobs, or they're not qualified for some reason for the jobs, or they don't get those jobs. And so what happens is that those individuals who are living in that neighborhood where that job production is supposed to be very dynamic,
Right.
they end up getting pushed down even more, or that gap begins to grow even more and more. And the fact that you talk about literacy and imparting values and imparting the history, not only of a family, but of a culture,
Right.
and of who you are, where you came from. You know, you talk about the genealogical research and Ancestry.com and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
But it's like, what is my culture about? You know, who am I in this whole broad scheme of things? How do I fit in there? And kids really adults are still struggling with that.
Well, and that's the thing that's exciting. What really turns on, we actually did an event for a family reunion this year out at Tower Grove Park. So in addition to bringing historical artifacts, we actually work with the organizers of the family reunion to do a family tree and do genealogical research. So that when they're getting together as a family, they now have a history to discuss.
Oh, that's great.
And when they had a history to discuss, now the artifacts make more sense.
Yep.
Because now we're talking about, we had an instance in which one of their ancestors was a carpenter as a slave. And so his descendants we actually had saws that former slaves were using. And so we were actually able to give them a sense of what their ancestor used, what their life was like. And so now that history is more relevant. It makes sense. Now I care about the Civil War because I know where my ancestors were. I know what they were doing, and I know how they contributed in their role.
That's really cool. That's really cool. We're going to talk more about that after the break. This is Arnold Stricker and Ellie Wharton of In Tune. You're listening to KWRHLP, 92.9 FM, your community radio station in Webster Groves, Missouri. Hey, it's a good time here in Webster Groves on In Tune. Arnold Stricker with Ellie Wharton. Hey, folks, if you've been listening to our first half hour with Mac Williams on History to You, this has been a very rich understanding of gaining the grasp on history as it relates to and personalizing history. And Mac, off the air, you made a comment about history being, I'm just going to vaguely quote it, and I want you to come back and say it correctly. History as important as culture should be as important culturally as socially. Say it correctly.
Oh, absolutely. And what I was talking about in that conversation, when I was in history class, even as a student of history and as someone that was passionate about history, even early on, I would still have, just like any other kid, I would still space out. I would still find segments of class boring. And it was because it didn't really relate to me, or at least I didn't see the connection. And so that's what History to You wants to do. And that's why when we're talking about culturally, we're talking about finding your place within history. So we did a genealogical study for my family's history, and one of the individuals on my father's side, we descend from North Carolina, and my direct ancestors at one time was owned by the Purdy family, Purdy, and the individual in the Purdy family that was the patriarch at the time, right at the time of the Civil War, was a man by the name of Thomas Purdy. He was actually a colonel in the Confederate Army. And for the listening audience, Stonewall Jackson. When Stonewall Jackson was killed, he was actually killed by friendly fire. Thomas Purdy was the man that ordered that firing.
Seriously. Wow,
and so
interesting.
Learning that history now made the Civil War make sense to me in terms of why I should be interested. because as a direct result of that experience, Thomas Purdy was actually killed in that same battle within 24 to 36 hours after Stonewall was shot. Thomas Purdy himself was killed, but for a long time that was the attachment or the association with that role in killing Stonewall Jackson. And many historians would argue if Stonewall Jackson survives, the Civil War could possibly have turned out differently.
Right, he was one of their big generals.
So to know that we had that connection to the Civil War gave me a vested interest to learn more about it. And then to study that history. And so my family, my ancestors, they actually changed their last name between 1870 and 1880 from Purdy to Blocker. And there was family lore about, why that happened. But I'm saying all of that to say that now I'm studying about Stonewall Jackson. Now I'm studying about, Thomas Purdy. Now I'm studying about what happened in the Reconstruction era in North Carolina and the years immediately following, because now I have a vested interest, because I'm learning about why I am who I am.
And what you do to help people learn where they are is you have like 34 courses that are available that an individual can enroll in, or they can do these in packages. And we're talking about things like the slave trade, tools of the slave, the Black abolitionist movement, the era of Black Reconstruction, the Fisk Jubilee Singers, Paul Laurence Dunbar, Marcus Garvey and the UNIA, Harlem Renaissance, racial tensions in St. Louis, and we had talked a little bit about that. And if you would mention a little bit about that conversation we had prior to the show starting about racial tensions in St. Louis, the pressure cooker.
And with each one of those topics that you just mentioned, we actually have historical artifacts related to them. So I don't want to get off topic too quickly, but just as one instance, we actually have there's a slave owner by the name of Franklin Watkins out of Prince Edward County, Virginia. That Watkins family had owned their area, the land in Prince Edward County. Still to this day, his descendants still own the same farmland. So since I believe, because I've spoken with one of the descendants directly, she mentioned that they had been there since about 1780 or so, about 240 years or so. And so they were in the process of fixing up the main home. And so they've been renovating and clearing out a lot of the land, which included dilapidated slave shacks that were later used by sharecroppers. And so they've been cleaning out those areas. And so when I began purchasing from them those artifacts, and so we actually have a collection of tools, silverware, items that were used by the slaves directly, and we actually know who those slaves were by name.
Wow.
We know where they were. We know the types of jobs that they had, because we were able to form that connection with the descendants, one of which her great grandfather is still alive. He's 96. And so he knew either directly or indirectly either those slaves themselves or their children, so that these stories can actually give us that history, so we can really give you a sense of what it was like. We can really create a good time capsule. And so that's what we've tried to do in each of these instances. For Marcus Garvey and the UNIA, we actually have stock certificate from the Black Star Line. We have copies of Black Man magazine from 1939 after he was exiled from the United States. So Paul Laurence Dunbar, we have the entire, with the exception of his first two books, we have the entire collection, all first editions of his works. So it's about actually having a topic, but then having the artifacts that you can touch, that you can see directly right in front of you, that makes that history more tangible.
Makes it come alive.
Absolutely. And so that's our point of emphasis, is trying to make the history more tangible. So now we were talking about racial tensions here in St. Louis. I'm not sure if a lot of people know about this, but there was a jazz club, and it was one of many, but it was called the Plantation Club, literally called the Plantation Club. And that was the theme. It was on Delmar. It's actually the building. It's called the Palladium Building now.
Okay.
And this is where a lot of early African American jazz musicians got their start. Miles Davis played there. You had Billy Eckstein, Billy Eckstein and his band played there. You had down the street, Chuck Berry. You had a lot of individuals that either played directly at the Plantation Club or got their start through individuals that came out of the Plantation Club. But it was just the depictions were just as racist as the name connotates. And so we actually have original menus from the Plantation Club. We actually have original matchbooks. We have original advertisements. And tying this into what we were talking about earlier, one of the other critical events here in St. Louis that was pivotal in this, and what would, I guess, be described as the civil rights era in St. Louis. It's a little different than other parts of the country. But we have artifacts from the race riot in Fairground Park over the integration of swimming pools in 1949. We have the original magazine article, and that was nationally publicated, that really documented what occurred here in Fairground. And so we used that to really describe the transition, because St. Louis is a little different than other parts of the country, that where you saw the racial unrest and you saw the actual manifestation of the civil rights movement in the form of marches, sit-ins, and demonstrations. You didn't have as much of that in St. Louis as you had in Selma, in Birmingham, and in other areas throughout the South. And a lot of that can be tied back to the race riot in 1949. What occurred at that point, that prior to that point, you had a slow integration of African Americans into the north side of the city of St. Louis. And as we were coming in, there was a gradual white exodus. But the events of the race riot at Fairground Park really kicked into high gear, that mass exodus, and a lot of that, and this is my personal opinion, based on reading and researching the events surrounding it. I think a lot of that had to do with the outcome, because in most race riots, up to that point, were one-sided. They really weren't race riots; they were really acts of terror, calling them what they were. Whereas with the Fairground, the incident at Fairground, yes, it was a situation in which there were white agitators that were attacking individuals that were just coming to swim. But these individuals fought back, and they went and grabbed their cousins, and they came and fought back. So you actually had a situation in which there were almost as many white people injured as African Americans. And that was scary. Because now you don't have that dominance that you can just assert your will over in other people. We resisted and we fought back, and we stood our ground. So that then led to an exodus. If I can't dominate, I'm getting out of here. I'm going to the county. And so within a couple of years, you had a tremendous swing in the population makeup of the city of St. Louis. And so what that did was that opened the door for opportunities for African Americans in the political realm far earlier than in other areas certainly throughout the South.
And you're talking about Lacey Clay.
Yeah, I was talking about Lacey Clay. We're talking about Jet Banks. We're talking about individuals of that nature. The Turpin family, that were some of the first police officers in the city of St. Louis, and they actually were some of the most prominent members of St. Louis. You had the development of Sumner High School. And, when it began, Sumner, that was a tremendous source of pride.
Oh, absolutely.
To say that you went to and you graduated from Sumner High School.
Oh, yeah. My mama graduated from Sumner.
And when you were a Bulldog, that meant something.
That meant something.
And
right.
It should still mean something, especially when those individuals who have gone to that school understand the history behind it. And so you saw that development on one hand, but on the other hand, you saw the development and the need for a Pruitt-Igoe. And you saw so what happened in St. Louis was the whole transition, or the results of the civil rights movement manifested themselves much earlier here in St. Louis. And what that led to then was it really prevented us from actually having those racial discussions, the true integration that was the intention of the civil rights era. And so what you then saw was we were integrated on paper, but that was it. And so that then led to the perpetuation of that de facto segregation. And so, I have a lot of individuals that come to visit St. Louis, and they would mention, especially, growing up, that this was an extremely segregated town. And it was designed that way,
Right.
Through the economic pressures. But because we had those outlets, we had a representative in the form of Lacey Clay. We had representation in the form of Jet Banks. We had representation in the form of other individuals. Our voice was tempered because we had that filter. Much in the same way that you had when Barack Obama was elected president of the United States, you had the expectation that African Americans were just supposed to be happy and satisfied. But it's no surprise that because of that that implied expectation, you had more racial unrest then, ironically, than you do now.
Which, when we were talking before the show, that one of the reasons Ferguson, the pressure cooker, all of this has just been kind of kept under the surface and it just heats up and then finally it just overflows.
Absolutely. When you think about it, one of the most significant historical events from a racial standpoint here in St. Louis harkens back to the days of Percy Green and attempting to integrate the VP Fair.
That's right. I remember that. As a matter of fact, I was going to a church over in Richmond Heights at the time, and it was one of the few integrated churches. It was a Lutheran church, and Percy Green. They invited Percy Green to come in and actually talk about that.
Right, and that was tremendous in terms of the impact here in the city of St. Louis for those individuals that grew up in it, that experienced the segregation and the separation and the implied superiority.
Right, exactly.
That
was the
came
thing.
with that notion that we had this grand ball that you couldn't go to, that we had, that they would give out silverware, silver platters, silver plates, things that were luxury items that to commemorate this exclusivity. And however, and I'm not saying this in any way as a slight to, certainly not a slight to Percy Green. That's a pioneering elder that has done significant, make significant gains for our people here in St. Louis. But if that could be considered the most radical thing that we had here in St. Louis, there really wasn't a Black Panther presence here in St. Louis. You didn't have those outlets of frustration to vent that frustration here in St. Louis that you had in other areas.
You didn't have police dogs, or you didn't have hoses on people. You didn't have large marches that walked through the downtown area, etc., like we saw in Birmingham or Selma.
Which directly and indirectly, like you talk about Birmingham. I'm a fan of Ricky Smiley, the comedian, but he talks all the time about what it meant to grow up in that environment and if you look at what he's done in his community and throughout the country, just like we talked about the way my parents raised me and instilled in me this passion to help, he's the same way. And that was a direct result of his experience growing up in Birmingham, where you had an environment where you saw Black men standing up, whether it was nonviolently or otherwise. You saw Black men taking a stance. And so you understand growing up that you have the same responsibility when the time comes to take that stance.
It's a passing of the mantle, if I may use that analogy.
That's, again, where we talk about history being culturally important. Mm-hmm. When you have that history to pass on, then it instills that sense of responsibility, and it compels those that are the students of that history to understand that I have a responsibility to do more with this.
And individuals can do that through the courses that you have, also the book club, the History to You Back to the Classics book club, and there's one coming up. I'm going through my papers right here.
Yes, it's this Saturday. This Saturday we're going to be looking at Elaine Brown's work, A Taste of Power. And we wanted to emphasize that certainly in this day and age, where you have the Me Too movement, you have the assertion of equality for women, which honestly, again, when you look at the cyclical nature of this country, why are we having this discussion when it took this country 100 30 years to, or 100, almost 150 years to give the right to vote to the woman and to women. And that should have resolved the questions of equality at that point. But yet we're still having this discussion now. And it's because we're not, again, our history books didn't really talk about the contributions of a Clara Barton, of a Susan B. Anthony,
right,
of a Charlotte Forden. We didn't learn history in an equal way.
And we didn't learn all of the history.
No, and certainly not in a balanced approach. And I think had we learned more and had more of a balance, again, as I mentioned to you earlier, I grew up in a home in which my mother emphasized our culture, but she also had a commanding presence. And so because she had such a commanding presence, my respect for women is automatic. And not only is it automatic, but I understand a woman's capacity to be a leader, because I had a home in which I had two leaders. Both of my parents were leaders in their own right. And so it's not foreign for me to see a woman in a leadership role.
Well, and it's not foreign to see that you have the mantle of leadership now.
Yeah.
And what you're doing for the community through History to You. Now, I know you've got a third section that you're getting ready to
yes,
roll out a little bit.
Yeah.
Talk briefly about that, because I want to make sure you have enough time to talk about that.
Absolutely. We're building, and right before I get into that, up to this point, we've given out about 750 books, between 750 and 800 books. Our goal is to give out 1,000 books here for the community. So that's been our mission. And so everyone that comes to the book club gets a free copy of the book. So we want to make sure that everyone understands that this is not just you come sit down and we talk about a book. No, you actually are building a library. If you come to our meetings month to month, you're getting a free copy of the book month to month. So at the end of the year, you have a 12-book library, and then next year we're doing the same thing.
And where are those meetings?
Those meetings are on the fourth Saturday of every month at the Julia Davis Library. So right at the corner of Natural Bridge and Newstead. We're right in the hood, as we like to say, but we wanted to be there because that's where the community needs it. And so we're based out of the 3rd Ward. We're in the city of St. Louis. We're not out in Chesterfield somewhere trying to tell people in the city what to do. No, we're right there with you. And that's why we have that ability to talk in the community and say what we need to say and do what we need to do. But that leads us to our next step. And our next step was progressing beyond the library and actually doing events in the community. We've participated in the Juneteenth celebrations with Fountain Park, with Coffee Right and her organization. We've participated in the St. Louis African American Artifacts Festival and Bazaar. We've done that for the last several years here as well. And so we wanted to do other events ourselves. And so we come up with the idea, it's called History in the Hood. And our goal is to have a festival for 2019 as our inaugural festival in Fairground Park to commemorate the 70th anniversary of those riots. And so we want to be able to talk with and explain to the community, this is how we got here.
Well, I think I have to add one thing, though, because being from Webster Groves.
Yes, ma'am.
See, what I find is that the city always looks at the city as being the only one that has a history to look at. Okay.
Absolutely.
The history that we had out here.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, with Webster, with Meacham Park, with Douglas Elementary.
Absolutely.
Okay, is a history that even growing up here, we had a difficult time expressing that was an extension of the history that we were dealing with in the city. And so we still deal with that. As a matter of fact, this radio station is a direct result of my life in terms of what you're saying. I grew up right up the street.
Yes, ma'am.
And you know what? I came back to my community centuries later. Okay. And created something that was needed in this community. So I want to say that let's not forget that the fight that was fought out here for education and Meacham Park and Chesterfield that had a black community.
Yeah,
and all of those
and even
need
in
to be
Kirkwood.
included. And that's right. That's
Yes,
Meacham
ma'am.
Park.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So
those things need to be included because of the fact that we are also the most vulnerable, because the communities can disappear, like the historical black community of Brentwood. That's now the Promenade.
Absolutely.
Shopping center. Like Meacham Park that now has all of the commercialization around it.
Like Kinloch, which doesn't exist
Kinloch that
anymore.
basically doesn't
Or-
exist.
Or even I'll even give you a more recent example here in the city with the NGA building. The NGA building is, and that whole project is backed right up to St. Louis Avenue.
Yep.
Right.
Backed right up to those museums.
That's right.
And so when you look at the development of the area around the NGA complex, where is that culture going to go? And so you always have this displacement of the people, but what compounds that is the displacement of the culture.
of the culture.
Right.
That's right.
And so, but you hit the nail on the head in the sense that our goal with History to You is to impact the parents to raise kids that do exactly what you did, and that's feel a sense of responsibility to their community.
To their community. That's right.
I actually reside in a building that our family has had since the 60s in the North Side. And so, again, a lot of individuals in our community, we've had it backwards. We've taught our kids to, the ones that are receiving the education, get educated so you can go out.
That's right, exactly.
But we're not telling them to come back.
Yep.
That's right. Exactly.
Our message is leave the hood. And that's exactly why our hoods remain dilapidated, because we're teaching our kids to abandon
It's the brain drain.
and start over somewhere else.
Yeah, it's the brain drain.
And then when you do that, you're looking to be integrated into someone else's culture in the process.
That's right.
And you wonder why you're not accepted. You wonder why you feel on the outside looking in, because we're not imploring our kids to strengthen the foundation and build upon it.
That's right.
We can make the North Side whatever we wish to make it if we choose to dedicate our energy and our efforts to it. And so what's happening now is you're saying the same thing, where we're in the county now while the city is being redeveloped. So we're going to be on the outside looking in as we see a whole new city, and we're displaced and we're dispersed amongst the 30 different municipalities,
Right.
in which we don't really have any control. And so that's, again, why we're trying to stop that now. We're trying to stem that tide by instilling that sense of pride, instilling that sense of responsibility to return back and to remain. There are so many things that we can do in the third ward. And I want to commend our alderman there, Brendan Bosch. He's doing a great job of re-energizing us.
That's wonderful.
I didn't, I wasn't involved in the local politics as much until I saw him as a young man, take that mantle.
Well, we have to have Mac back on.
Absolutely.
And finish this, continue the conversation, not finish it, continue the conversation. On November 2nd, we're going to have Ken Morris on the air. And Ken Morris, Ellie, you're going to be really surprised, Frederick Douglass's great-great-great-grandson, and he's also Booker T. Washington's great-great-grandson. He's going to be on the air with us.
And that's another thing. I mean, that ties in, and to kind of lead the show. That's royalty.
That's correct.
And in our community, Kenneth Morrison, he should be seen as royalty.
That's right.
And respected and revered as such, especially when he's
what we're
trying to.
doing is making Beyonce and people like that royalty.
Right. and
Nothing wrong with Beyonce.
We love. I hope anyone in the Beehive out there.
That's right.
Don't buzz.
But we actually know that we actually have to elevate individuals that can tell us and can continue that history.
Well, we're going to continue this conversation in some future broadcasts. This is Arnold Stricker with Ellie Wharton of In Tune. You're listening to KWRHLP 92.9 FM, your community radio station in Webster Groves, Missouri.